My name is Sage. I am 26 years old, and 3 months ago, I watched my own parents get arrested for breaking into what they thought was still my apartment. The look of absolute shock on their faces when the police officer explained they were trespassing on someone else's property was worth every sleepless night. I had spent planning this moment. But what led me to orchestrate my own parents' downfall started with a single violated boundary that spiraled into a family war I never saw coming. Before we dive into how I turned the tables on the two people who were supposed to protect me, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you have ever dealt with family members who just would not respect your boundaries, and subscribe, because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you will want to see how deep this rabbit hole of family betrayal actually goes. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I had just moved into my first solo apartment in downtown Seattle after graduating college and landing my dream job at a tech startup. For the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. I had my own space, my own rules, and my own privacy. Or at least that is what I thought. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning. I came home from work to find my mother sitting at my kitchen table, casually eating yogurt from my refrigerator like she owned the place. When I asked how she got in, she held up a spare key and smiled. "We made copies when you gave us the emergency key, sweetheart. We just wanted to make sure your apartment was safe and clean." I stood there completely dumbfounded. I had given them one emergency key, for actual emergencies, not for surprise inspections of my living situation. But my mother continued talking as if this was perfectly normal behavior. "Your father and I were worried about you living alone in the city. We just pop by sometimes to check on things when you are at work. Do not worry, we do not touch anything important." That statement turned out to be a complete lie. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. My mail had been opened and resealed. Items in my bedroom had been moved around. My laptop had been used. The browser history showed searches I definitely had not made. Food I had bought would mysteriously disappear, replaced with health food alternatives my mother preferred. The breaking point came when I found a hidden camera in my living room. Not a professional security camera, a cheap spy camera tucked behind a picture frame. When I confronted my parents about it, their response made my blood run cold. "We are just concerned parents, Sage. You never call us enough, so we wanted to make sure you were okay, and not bringing home any unsavory characters." Unsavory characters. They were spying on my dating life, my personal conversations, my private moments in my own home. The violation felt deeper than anything I had ever experienced. These were the people who had raised me to value privacy and personal boundaries, yet they were systematically destroying mine. I demanded they return all copies of my keys immediately. They promised they would, but I knew they were lying. I could see it in the way my father avoided eye contact and how my mother kept insisting they had only made one copy when I had clearly seen multiple keys on their ring. That weekend, I installed new locks and a security system. I felt like I was protecting myself from burglars, except these burglars happened to share my DNA. The irony was not lost on me, but changing the locks only escalated things. The following Monday, I came home to find my front door slightly damaged around the lock mechanism. Someone had tried to force their way in. My security system had recorded everything, and sure enough, there were my parents trying to jimmy the lock with various tools like amateur criminals. When I called them that evening, they did not even try to deny it. "You are being ridiculous, Sage. We are your parents. We have a right to know that you are safe. You have a right to call me or text me. You do not have a right to break into my apartment. We are not breaking in. You are our daughter." This is just being good parents. Their complete inability to understand basic boundaries was astounding. They genuinely believed that being my parents gave them unlimited access to my private space and personal life. Every attempt I made to explain why their behavior was inappropriate was met with gaslighting and manipulation. "You never used to be so secretive, Sage. What are you hiding from us? Are you on drugs? Are you involved with someone we should know about?" The accusations kept coming. They convinced themselves that my desire for privacy meant I was hiding something terrible. They started showing up at my workplace, asking my coworkers if I seemed different lately. They contacted my friends fishing for information about my personal life. They even called my landlord, trying to convince him that I was a problematic tenant who needed parental supervision. The harassment was relentless and methodical. They had turned my independence into their personal mission to control. Every boundary I set was treated as a challenge to overcome rather than a request to respect. The final straw came when I discovered they had been intercepting my mail by filing a change of address form with the postal service, redirecting my mail to their house. Important documents, bank statements, even personal letters from friends were being filtered through my parents before I ever saw them. When I confronted them about mail fraud, because that is exactly what it was, they acted like I was being dramatic. We just wanted to make sure you were not missing anything important. You can be so scattered sometimes. That night I sat in my violated apartment and realized something that chilled me to the bone. My parents were not just overprotective. They were not just having trouble letting go. They were systematically stalking me, invading my privacy, and committing actual crimes in the name of parental concern. And they felt completely justified in doing it. I knew that simply asking them to stop would never work. They had proven that my words, my boundaries, and my feelings meant nothing to them when weighed against their perceived right to control my life. Traditional confrontation had failed. Setting boundaries had failed. Even involving my landlord and changing locks had failed. That is when I realized I needed to fight fire with fire. If they wanted to play games with boundaries and consequences, then it was time for them to learn what real consequences looked like. But I had to be smart about it. I had to make sure that when the hammer fell, they could not wiggle out of it or turn themselves into the victims. The plan that started forming in my mind was simple in concept, but would require careful execution. They wanted access to my apartment so badly. Fine. I would give them exactly what they were asking for, just not in the way they expected. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity about what needed to happen. My parents had crossed so many legal and ethical lines that they had essentially handed me the roadmap for their own downfall. All I had to do was follow it. My first step was documentation. I spent the entire weekend organizing evidence of their harassment. Photos of the damaged lock, security footage of their break-in attempts, copies of the mail fraud paperwork, screenshots of their surprise visits recorded by my security system. I created a timeline of every violation, every boundary crossed, every law broken. The evidence was damning. In their desperation to control me, my parents had committed mail fraud, attempted breaking and entering, trespassing, harassment, and stalking. They had created a paper trail that would make a prosecutor salivate, but I needed more than just evidence. I needed a strategy that would ensure they faced real consequences while protecting myself from their inevitable retaliation. That is when I remembered my college friend Marcus, who had become a criminal defense attorney. During a casual conversation over coffee, I explained my situation without revealing my growing plan. Sage, what you are describing is not just overprotective parenting. This is criminal harassment with multiple felony components. If someone was doing this to a stranger, they would be looking at serious jail time. But they are my parents. Does not that change things legally? Not even a little bit. Family relationships do not grant anyone the right to commit crimes. In fact, some states have enhanced penalties for crimes committed against family members because the violation of trust makes it worse, not better. Marcus helped me understand exactly which laws my parents had broken and what kind of evidence would be needed for successful prosecution. He also explained something crucial. The best defense against manipulative family members is often to let them destroy themselves with their own actions. The thing about people who feel entitled to break rules is that they rarely stop when faced with obstacles. They usually escalate. If you create the right circumstances, they will hang themselves with their own rope. That conversation gave me the final piece of my puzzle. I did not need to actively destroy my parents. I just needed to create a situation where their own behavior would have natural legal consequences they could not manipulate or escape. I started apartment hunting that week, but with very specific criteria. I needed a place that looked similar to my current apartment from the outside, preferably in the same neighborhood. More importantly, I needed landlords who took security seriously and had zero tolerance for unauthorized access. After 2 weeks of searching, I found the perfect setup. a duplex owned by a retired police officer named Frank, who had converted his property into 2 rental units after his wife passed away. Frank lived in one unit and rented out the other. He was exactly the kind of landlord who would not hesitate to call police if someone broke into his property. During our meeting, I was completely honest with Frank about my situation, though I framed it as seeking protection from harassment rather than setting a trap. My parents have been stalking me and breaking into my current apartment. I need somewhere secure where that behavior will have immediate consequences if they try to continue it. Frank's expression darkened. I spent 30 years dealing with stalkers and harassers. That kind of behavior only stops when there are real consequences. You move in here, and if anyone tries to break into this property, they will be dealing with me and the Seattle Police Department. Perfect. The next phase required careful timing. I had to move out of my current apartment and into Frank's place without my parents discovering the change until it was too late. I arranged for the move during weekday business hours when I knew they would both be at work. Professional movers handled everything in 4 hours. But here is where my plan got devious. Instead of informing my parents about the move, I decided to let them discover it naturally. I forwarded my mail properly, this time installed a security system in my new place, and waited. I knew my parents well enough to predict their behavior. They had been entering my old apartment at least twice a week for months. They felt entitled to that access, and they had proven repeatedly that locked doors would not stop them. Meanwhile, I prepared my new landlord Frank for what might be coming. I showed him photos of my parents and explained their pattern of behavior. Frank, drawing on his police experience, helped me set up additional security measures and established a clear protocol for handling any unauthorized access attempts. The beauty of this situation is that they will be trespassing on property that belongs to someone who never gave them permission to be there. There is no gray area, no family drama to muddy the waters. Just clean prosecutable criminal trespass. I also quietly informed a few strategic people about my move without revealing my motivations. My boss at work, my closest friends, and my apartment management company all knew I had relocated. This created witnesses who could confirm I had moved legitimately and was no longer a resident of my old address. The hardest part was maintaining normal contact with my parents while internally preparing for the nuclear bomb I was about to drop on our relationship. I continued taking their calls, responding to their texts, and pretending everything was normal. They had no idea that their next attempt to violate my boundaries would result in criminal charges instead of another family argument. 3 weeks after my move, I was settled into my new place and feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in months. My new apartment felt like a sanctuary. Frank was a respectful landlord who understood boundaries. My commute was actually shorter, and best of all, I could come home each day without wondering what violation of privacy awaited me. But I knew the peace was temporary. My parents would eventually attempt to access my old apartment again, and when they did, they would discover that their victim had disappeared and been replaced by a very different kind of consequence. I had transformed from their helpless target into the architect of their comeuppance. They had spent months teaching me that actions have consequences through their relentless boundary violations. Soon they were going to learn that lesson themselves in a way they would never forget. The trap was set. All that remained was waiting for them to spring it themselves. The waiting game lasted exactly 11 days. On a Thursday afternoon, I was at work when my phone started buzzing with notifications from my old apartment's security system. Even though I no longer lived there, I had maintained the monitoring service specifically for this moment. The cameras I had left behind showed exactly what I had predicted: my parents standing at my former front door with their lock-picking tools, looking frustrated that their usual methods were not working. What I had not expected was how brazen they would become. Instead of giving up when the locks did not yield, they escalated to trying to break down the door. My father was actually using a crowbar on the door frame, while my mother acted as a lookout. They had gone from amateur stalking to full criminal breaking and entering, all captured in high-definition video. But the most beautiful part was what happened next. My old neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had gotten used to seeing my parents coming and going over the past months. But seeing them violently attacking a door in broad daylight triggered her to call building management immediately. Within minutes, my former landlord arrived on scene. I had specifically chosen not to inform him about my move because I wanted this moment to play out naturally. When he confronted my parents, their explanation was perfect evidence of their entitlement and criminal intent. We are Sage's parents. She changed the locks on us, and we need to check on her welfare. She has been acting strange lately, and we are worried she might hurt herself. My landlord, Mr. Rodriguez, was not buying it. Sage moved out 3 weeks ago. She returned her keys and fulfilled her lease obligations properly. You are currently attempting to break into an apartment that belongs to new tenants who moved in yesterday. The security footage captured my parents' faces perfectly in that moment. The realization that they had been breaking into someone else's home, that their daughter had escaped their surveillance network, and that they were now facing criminal consequences instead of family drama. My father actually tried to argue with Mr. Rodriguez, insisting that I could not have moved without telling them. There must be some mistake. Sage would never move without informing her family. We are very close, Mr. Rodriguez, who had dealt with my parents' harassment calls for months, was done being polite. Sir, I am calling the police. You need to leave this property immediately or you will be arrested for criminal trespass and attempted burglary. That is when my mother made the mistake that sealed their fate. Instead of leaving, she tried to push past Mr. Rodriguez to continue breaking into the apartment. She actually put her hands on him and attempted to shove him out of the way so she could finish breaking down the door. Now, it was not just trespassing and attempted burglary. It was assault. Mr. Rodriguez called 911 while my parents continued arguing with him about their rights as my family. They genuinely could not understand that those rights ended where other people's property began. The responding officers arrived to find my parents still on the property, still demanding access to an apartment that was no longer mine with a damaged door and witnesses to multiple crimes. I watched the entire arrest unfold through my security system from my office. The looks on their faces when the handcuffs clicked shut was a mixture of shock, indignation, and confusion. They kept insisting to the officers that this was all a misunderstanding, that they were just concerned parents checking on their daughter. The police were not sympathetic. They had dealt with stalking cases before, and my parents' behavior fit the profile perfectly. Entitled, escalating, unwilling to accept boundaries, and convinced their motivations justified their crimes. But the real validation came when Detective Morrison contacted me later that day. Mr. Rodriguez had given the police my contact information, and they needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening. I drove to the station that evening with my carefully organized evidence file. Detective Morrison was a woman in her 40s who specialized in domestic harassment cases. As I laid out the timeline of violations, the documentation of break-ins, and the evidence of mail fraud, her expression grew increasingly serious. Sage, what you are describing is a textbook escalating stalking case. The fact that the perpetrators are your parents does not make it less serious. In some ways, it makes it worse because family stalkers often have access to more personal information and feel more entitled to continue their behavior. She explained that my parents were facing multiple felony charges: criminal trespass, attempted burglary, assault on a property manager, mail fraud, and stalking. Because they had documented pattern of behavior over several months, the prosecutor would likely argue for enhanced penalties. The beautiful thing about your case is how well documented everything is. Most stalking victims struggle to prove the pattern of behavior, but you have security footage, witnesses, and a clear timeline of escalating violations. Your parents basically built the case against themselves. Detective Morrison also revealed something that made me realize how deep their obsession had gone. During their arrest, police had searched my mother's purse and found printed copies of my social media posts. Photos of my apartment building taken from across the street, and a notebook containing detailed logs of my daily routine, including when I left for work and returned home. They had been conducting full surveillance on me for months. This was not overprotective parenting. This was criminal stalking with premeditation and planning. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Maria Santos, contacted me the following week to discuss my willingness to testify and provide evidence. Maria specialized in family crimes and had seen cases like mine before. The challenge with family stalking cases is that victims often feel guilty about prosecuting their relatives, But what your parents did goes far beyond family dysfunction. They committed serious crimes, and they showed no signs of stopping on their own. Maria explained that my parents' behavior would likely escalate if there were no consequences. Stalkers who feel entitled to their victim's life rarely stop voluntarily. They typically escalate until they face legal consequences or until they are physically prevented from continuing. She was right. Even after their arrest, my parents were not backing down. They had bonded out of jail within hours and immediately started calling everyone in my life, trying to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family. They contacted my workplace, my friends, even my college professors, trying to build a narrative that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and needed family intervention. But their campaign to discredit me only strengthened the stalking case against them. Every contact they made with people in my life was additional evidence of harassment. They were so focused on proving they were right that they continued committing the same crimes that had gotten them arrested in the first place. My friends and colleagues were horrified by my parents' behavior. My boss at the tech startup, Jennifer, was particularly supportive after my parents showed up at our office, demanding to speak with someone about my concerning behavior changes. "Sage, I have worked with you for 8 months. You are professional, reliable, and show no signs of any kind of distress or mental health issues. Your parents' behavior, however, is deeply concerning. If they contact this workplace again, we will be filing harassment charges independently." The solidarity I felt from my chosen family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, was overwhelming. People who had known me as an independent adult could clearly see that my parents' behavior was inappropriate and criminal. Their attempts to paint me as the problem only highlighted how delusional their perspective had become. As the court date approached, I realized that my parents had accomplished something I never could have planned. By refusing to accept consequences for their actions and doubling down on their harassment even after arrest, they had eliminated any possibility of portraying themselves as well-meaning but misguided parents. They had revealed themselves to be exactly what they were: criminals who felt entitled to violate other people's rights when it suited their desires. The justice system was about to teach them a lesson about consequences that no amount of family manipulation could undo. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November. I had taken the day off, work dressed professionally, and prepared myself to face my parents in court for the first time since their arrest. What I was not prepared for was how they had chosen to present themselves. My mother wore a conservative dress and carried tissues, clearly planning to play the role of the heartbroken mother whose ungrateful daughter had destroyed the family. My father sat rigidly beside their attorney, a man who looked like he specialized in defending domestic violence cases and probably wished he had never taken this one. Their lawyer's opening statement was predictably manipulative. He painted a picture of loving parents who were simply concerned about their daughter's welfare and had made some admittedly overzealous attempts to ensure her safety. He tried to argue that family relationships operated under different rules than stranger relationships, and that my parents' actions, while misguided, came from a place of love rather than malice. But prosecutor Maria Santos was ready for this angle. Her opening statement systematically dismantled the concerned parent narrative by walking the jury through the timeline of escalating violations. She displayed enlarged photos of the damaged locks, played audio from security recordings, and presented the notebook full of surveillance details my mother had been keeping. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case about overprotective parents. This is a case about two adults who decided that their desires mattered more than their daughter's rights, more than the law, and more than basic human decency. The evidence will show that the defendants engaged in a months-long campaign of stalking, harassment, and criminal trespass that escalated to violent breaking and entering when their victim escaped their control. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Mr. Rodriguez testified about the months of harassment calls and the violent door-breaking incident. Mrs. Chen described watching my parents case the building and attempt break-ins. Detective Morrison walked the jury through the evidence of systematic stalking behavior. But the most damaging testimony came from Frank, my new landlord and retired police officer. Maria had subpoenaed him not because of anything that happened at his property, but because of his expertise in stalking cases and his assessment of my parents' behavior pattern. In my 30 years of law enforcement, I encountered hundreds of stalking cases. The defendant's behavior follows a textbook escalation pattern. They started with boundary violations that seemed minor, then systematically increased the severity when their victim attempted to establish boundaries. The fact that they continued their criminal behavior even after being arrested shows they have no intention of respecting the victim's rights voluntarily. Frank's professional opinion carried enormous weight with the jury. This was not some young woman being dramatic about family drama. This was a career law enforcement officer explaining that my parents' behavior represented a genuine threat that would only escalate without legal intervention. When my turn came to testify, I was surprisingly calm. Months of documentation and preparation had given me confidence in the facts. I simply told the truth about each violation, each escalation, each moment when I had tried to set boundaries only to have them bulldozed by people who claimed to love me. The defense attorney tried to paint me as secretive and ungrateful, suggesting that my desire for privacy was suspicious and that normal parents would be concerned by such behavior. But his questions only gave me opportunities to highlight how inappropriate my parents' responses had been. Miss Sage, is it not natural for parents to worry when their child suddenly becomes secretive about their personal life? It might be natural to worry, but it is not legal to commit mail fraud, break into someone's apartment, or install hidden cameras to spy on them. Concern does not justify criminal behavior. But did you ever simply sit down and have an honest conversation with your parents about their concerns? I had dozens of conversations with them. I explicitly told them their behavior was inappropriate and illegal. They responded by escalating their violations. When someone tells you that installing spy cameras in their home is unacceptable, the appropriate response is to apologize and not to start breaking down doors. The cross-examination actually strengthened my testimony because it highlighted how reasonable my responses had been and how unreasonable my parents' escalation had become. But the moment that sealed my parents' fate came when they testified in their own defense. Against their attorney's obvious advice, both of them insisted on taking the stand to explain their side of the story. My mother's testimony was a masterclass in self-incrimination. She actually admitted to most of the criminal behavior while arguing that it was justified by her parental concerns. She confirmed that she had made copies of my key without permission, that she had entered my apartment regularly without my knowledge, and that she had installed the spy camera because she did not trust my judgment about men. I am her mother. I brought her into this world, and I have a responsibility to protect her even when she does not want to be protected. Children do not always know what is best for them. When the prosecutor asked her how old I was, her answer destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had. She is 26, but she has always been naive about people's intentions. My father's testimony was even worse. He seemed genuinely confused about why their behavior was being treated as criminal, and his answers revealed the depth of their entitlement. We never intended to hurt anyone. We just wanted to make sure our daughter was safe and making good choices. Parents have been looking out for their children for thousands of years. Since when is that illegal? When asked about the mail fraud, he actually argued that they had been helping me by screening my mail for important documents I might miss. When asked about the break-in attempts, he insisted they were just trying to access their own daughter's apartment to check on her welfare. The prosecutor's follow-up questions were devastating. Mr. Smith, did your daughter ever tell you to stop entering her apartment without permission? Yes, but she was not thinking clearly. Did she change her locks to prevent your access? Yes, but that just proved she was hiding something from us. Did you attempt to break down her door when your key no longer worked? We were concerned for her safety. Were you concerned for her safety, or were you angry that she had escaped your control? My father's pause before answering that question told the jury everything they needed to know. This was not about my safety. This was about their need to control me and their fury that I had successfully escaped that control. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, my parents looked genuinely shocked. Even after months of evidence, testimony, and legal proceedings, they still believed they would be vindicated because their intentions had been good. But intentions do not matter when you are committing crimes. Impact matters. Behavior matters. And the impact of their behavior had been to terrorize their own daughter into hiding from them and seeking protection from the legal system. As the judge read the guilty verdicts, I felt something I had not experienced in months: complete validation. A jury of 12 strangers had listened to all the evidence and concluded that my parents' behavior was criminal, unacceptable, and deserving of legal consequences. The people who had raised me to respect rules and boundaries had been found guilty of systematically violating both. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was where my parents finally grasped the full scope of what they had destroyed. Judge Patricia Williams had reviewed all the evidence, the pre-sentencing reports, and the victim impact statement I had submitted. Her words still echo in my mind. The defendants seemed to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of their crimes. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding about boundaries. This was a sustained campaign of criminal harassment against their own daughter that escalated to violent crime when she attempted to escape their control. My mother received 18 months in prison plus 3 years of supervised probation. My father received 15 months plus the same probation period. Both were ordered to have no contact with me for 5 years and to undergo mandatory counseling for boundary violations and stalking behavior. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of their downfall. The local newspaper had picked up the story during the trial, and the details of their crimes had spread throughout their social circles, their workplace, and their community. The headline read, "Local couple convicted of stalking their own daughter." My father lost his job at the accounting firm where he had worked for 15 years. His employer could not risk having a convicted stalker on staff, especially one whose crimes demonstrated such poor judgment and lack of impulse control. My mother's part-time position at the church was terminated immediately after her conviction. The pastor explained that they could not have someone convicted of stalking and harassment working with vulnerable populations. Their social circle evaporated overnight. Friends, who had known them for decades, suddenly found reasons to avoid contact. Neighbors stopped speaking to them. Their church community, where they had been active members for over 20 years, made it clear they were no longer welcome. The financial impact was devastating. Legal fees, court costs, and the loss of my father's income forced them to sell their house and move into a small apartment across town. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle they had maintained for decades crumbled under the weight of their criminal convictions. But what destroyed them most was the complete collapse of their victim narrative. Throughout the legal proceedings, they had convinced themselves that eventually people would understand they had been loving parents, making difficult choices to protect their child. They believed that once the full story came out, they would be vindicated, and I would be seen as an ungrateful daughter who had overreacted to normal parental concern. Instead, every detail that emerged made their behavior look worse. The notebook full of surveillance details, the systematic mail theft, the escalating break-in attempts, each piece of evidence reinforced that they were criminals who had terrorized their own child. My extended family's reaction was particularly brutal for them. My Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, had initially tried to mediate and encourage reconciliation. But after attending the trial and hearing the full scope of their behavior, she cut contact completely. "I cannot believe you are my brother. What you did to Sage is unforgivable. She trusted you to love and protect her, and instead you stalked and terrorized her. You are strangers to me now." My mother's parents, who had always been critical of what they saw as my independence and lack of family devotion, shocked everyone by taking my side completely. "We raised you better than this, Margaret. Sage is our granddaughter, not your property. What you did was sick and wrong, and we are ashamed to be related to you." The isolation was complete. They had alienated everyone in their lives in pursuit of controlling mine, and now they had neither their victim nor their support system. I learned about most of this aftermath through Frank, my landlord, who had stayed in touch after the trial. As a retired police officer, he had contacts throughout the community who kept him informed about how my parents were handling their new reality. "They are not handling it well, Sage. Your father has been seen arguing with former neighbors about how unfair the conviction was. Your mother tried to contact your old church to get them to intercede on her behalf. They are still convinced they are the victims in this situation. Their complete inability to accept responsibility or acknowledge wrongdoing meant they learned nothing from the consequences they had faced. Even after conviction, imprisonment, and social ostracism, they continued to view themselves as martyrs who had sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. This became clear when they violated their no-contact order just 3 months into their prison sentences. Despite being explicitly warned that any attempt to contact me would result in additional charges, my mother convinced another inmate's family member to deliver a letter to me at my workplace. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation and self-pity. She wrote about how much they missed me, how sorry they were that I could not understand their love, and how they hoped I would find it in my heart to forgive them for caring too much. Not once did she acknowledge that their behavior had been wrong. Not once did she take responsibility for the crimes they had committed. The letter was entirely focused on their pain, their loss, and their desire for reconciliation on their terms. I turned the letter over to Prosecutor Santos immediately. My mother's parole was revoked, and she received an additional 6 months for violating the protective order. The justice system had given them every opportunity to learn from their mistakes, and they had chosen to continue their criminal behavior even from prison. The most devastating moment came when I ran into my father's former business partner Robert at a coffee shop downtown. Robert and my father had been close friends for over a decade, and I had expected him to avoid me or perhaps express some sympathy for my parents' situation. Instead, Robert's words cut straight to the heart of who my parents really were. "Sage, I want you to know that everyone who truly knows what happened supports you completely. Your parents are not the people we thought they were." The fact that they could do what they did to their own daughter shows a level of selfishness and cruelty that none of us recognized before. You did the right thing by protecting yourself, and anyone who says otherwise does not understand what real love looks like. That conversation made me realize something profound by forcing my parents to face consequences for their actions. I had not just protected myself. I had revealed their true character to everyone around them. Their crimes had stripped away the facade of loving parents and exposed the controlling, entitled, boundary-violating people they had always been. The people who mattered could see the difference between love and control, between protection and possession, between concern and criminal behavior. Justice had been served not just in the courtroom, but in every relationship and every community connection my parents had destroyed through their own choices. 2 years have passed since my parents' conviction, and the peace I feel now is something I never could have imagined during those months of harassment and violation. The silence, where their chaos used to be, has become the foundation for rebuilding my life on my own terms. Frank became more than just a landlord. He became a mentor and father figure who showed me what healthy boundaries actually look like. When I mentioned feeling guilty about the consequences my parents had faced, his response changed my perspective forever. "Sage, you did not send your parents to prison. They sent themselves to prison through their choices and their crimes. Your only responsibility was to protect yourself, and you did that brilliantly." The fact that they faced consequences is proof that the system worked exactly as it should. He was right. I had not orchestrated their downfall. I had simply refused to continue enabling their criminal behavior. Everything that happened to them afterward was the natural result of their own actions and their refusal to change course, even when given multiple opportunities. My career flourished without the constant stress of wondering what violation awaited me at home. My boss, Jennifer, offered me a promotion to team lead, noting that my focus and productivity had improved dramatically over the past year. When I explained the situation during my performance review, her response was immediate and supportive. "Sage, what you went through is traumatic, and the way you handled it shows incredible strength and judgment. You protected yourself and held people accountable for criminal behavior. That kind of integrity and problem-solving ability is exactly what we want in leadership positions." The promotion came with a significant salary increase and stock options that secured my financial independence completely. For the first time in my life, I was not just surviving, I was thriving. My social circle expanded in ways I had never expected. The friends who had supported me through the trial became deeper, more meaningful relationships. I also connected with other people who had experienced family trauma and boundary violations. We formed an informal support group that met monthly to share experiences and strategies for maintaining healthy relationships. One member of our group, a woman named Alex, who had gone no contact with her abusive family 3 years earlier, helped me understand something crucial about guilt and family loyalty. The people who raised us taught us that family comes first, that blood is thicker than water, that we owe our parents everything because they gave us life. But they conveniently left out the part where respect, boundaries, and basic human decency still apply within families. Love is not supposed to hurt, control, or violate. What you experienced was not love, it was possession. The 5-year no-contact order has been both a blessing and a revelation. Without their constant interference, I discovered parts of myself that had been suppressed by their need to control every aspect of my life. I took up photography, traveled to countries they would never have approved of, dated people who did not meet their narrow criteria, and made decisions based purely on what I wanted rather than what would avoid their criticism. 6 months ago, I met someone who changed everything. David is a social worker who specializes in family trauma and boundary violations. When I told him about my parents' crimes and the trial, his reaction was immediate understanding rather than the shock or discomfort I had learned to expect. You handled an impossible situation with incredible wisdom and courage. Most people who experience family stalking never find the strength to hold their abusers accountable. You probably saved yourself from decades of escalating harassment. David's professional experience with family dysfunction has given him insights that help me continue healing. He has helped me understand that my parents' behavior was part of a pattern that likely would have continued indefinitely without legal intervention. Stalkers do not stop voluntarily, Sage. They escalate until they are forced to stop. Your parents proved that even arrest and prosecution were not enough to change their behavior. They violated the no-contact order from prison. That tells you everything you need to know about their commitment to respecting your boundaries. Last month, I received an unexpected call from Detective Morrison. My parents had been arrested again, this time for harassing David's family in an attempt to get information about me. Despite being on supervised probation and explicitly warned about continued criminal behavior, they had hired a private investigator to track my movements and relationships. Sage, they are facing enhanced penalties this time because of their prior convictions and parole violations. The judge is likely to impose the maximum sentence because they have proven they will not stop this behavior voluntarily. The news should have upset me, but instead I felt only relief. Their latest arrest proved that my decision to cut contact and involve the legal system had been absolutely necessary. They had not learned, they had not changed, and they had not developed respect for boundaries even after losing everything. Their inability to change vindicated every choice I had made to protect myself. I was not an ungrateful daughter who had overreacted to normal parental concern. I was a victim who had successfully escaped an escalating pattern of criminal harassment that showed no signs of stopping. Frank, who had become like a father to me, summed it up perfectly when I told him about their latest arrest. Some people have to learn the hard way that actions have consequences. Your parents have chosen to learn that lesson repeatedly rather than simply respecting your boundaries. That is their choice, not your fault. The family I have built for myself now includes Frank, Jennifer, from work, my support group, friends David, and others who understand that love means respect, not control. These people celebrate my independence rather than trying to undermine it. They support my decisions rather than trying to override them. They respect my boundaries rather than treating them as challenges to overcome. This chosen family has taught me what healthy relationships actually look like. There is no surveillance, no violation of privacy, no attempts to control my choices or lifestyle. There is support without strings attached, concern without criminal behavior, and love without possession. The scared young woman who once came home to find her mother eating yogurt in her kitchen has become someone who sets clear boundaries and enforces them consistently. I learned that protecting yourself from people who claim to love you is not betrayal. It is survival and self-respect. My parents taught me many things during my childhood, but the most important lesson came from their crimes: that blood relationship does not grant anyone the right to violate control or terrorize you. Family is supposed to be a source of support and love, not a prison of surveillance and manipulation. To anyone watching who has family members who refuse to respect boundaries, who violate your privacy, who escalate when you try to protect yourself, you are not crazy, you are not ungrateful, and you are not alone. Sometimes, the people who raised us are not capable of treating us with basic respect, and in those cases, protecting yourself is not just acceptable, it is necessary. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries with family members who refused to respect them? How did you handle relatives who thought family connection gave them unlimited access to your life? Drop your experiences in the comments. I read everyone, and your stories help others who might be struggling with similar situations. If this story resonated with you or helped you feel less alone in dealing with boundary-violating family members, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for yourself and finding your chosen family. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that protecting yourself from toxic family members is not just okay, it is brave. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of the community that reminds me every day that I made the right choice in choosing peace over chaos, respect over control, and healthy love over toxic possession. Remember that you deserve relationships built on mutual respect, and never let anyone convince you that family obligation requires you to accept criminal behavior. Until next time, protect your peace and trust your instincts. They are usually right.